Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to talk about distinguishing between clean and unclean animals. Now, before we begin, I want to talk about the reason that we're doing this, the reason that we're distinguishing between clean and unclean animals. And it's not the reason that you probably have heard. The common reason that gets thrown around is that, hey, it's about health, pigs are bad to eat, that kind of thing. And so therefore, the whole reason for the clean unclean distinction is because of health. The problem is the text does not say that. And actually, the text gives us a reason, a different reason. So let's look at what it says in Leviticus 20, verses 24 through 26. I caused to divide you from the peoples. You shall cause to divide between the beast, the clean to unclean, and between the flying animal, the unclean to clean. And you shall not loathe your vitalities in beast and in flying animal and in all which shall move the ground, which I cause to divide to you, to make unclean. And you shall be to me holy ones, that I am holy, Yahuwah, and I cause to divide you from the peoples to be to me. So Leviticus 20 actually tells us why we're doing this, why we are dividing between the clean and the unclean. And that's because he divided us from the peoples. So let's keep that in mind as we proceed. Now, what actually causes certain animals to be clean? What causes certain animals to be unclean? Another confusion that has persisted is that it has something to do with the animal's diet. However, that is not what the text says. The text doesn't say anything about their diet. What it actually talks about is how they are made, how God made them. It talks about the anatomy of the animal typically. So these are the kinds of things we're going to be paying attention to. We're going to be paying attention to the physical features of the animals. So let's talk about the beasts. We're given two criteria to determine whether a beast is clean or unclean. They must fit both criteria in order to pass as a clean animal. And those two are, number one, they must ascend the cud. Now, the wording here is a little bit different maybe than what we might be used to in English, but for our purposes it's close enough. They stir the cud. Generally we're talking about kind of a ruminant type animal. So number one, they stir the cud. Number two is that they must divide the hoof. And so we're talking about cloven hooves, talking about they must have hooves to begin with, and those hooves must be divided. Now, the text itself actually gives us, in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, gives us examples of both unclean and clean animals. Now, using this criteria, we should be able to pretty easily tell if we're looking at the animal whether it's clean or unclean. But it gives us some examples anyway, so let's talk about them. It tells us that these animals are unclean. The hare, the hyrax, and the pig. Now the text says that each of these fit one of the criteria, one of the two, but it doesn't fit both. So they are unclean. We're not to eat them, and we're not to touch their carcasses. Now it does give us also examples of some clean beasts. Deuteronomy 14 talks about cattle, sheep, goats, deer, antelope, oryx, and also giraffe. Giraffe, believe it or not, is clean, even though we probably aren't going to be getting our hands on that. Now, another example of an animal that's clean is bison. Bison are allowed, bison are clean. They both ascend the cud, and they also divide the hoof. So they are clean. That is the criteria for beasts, and those are examples of both clean and unclean beasts. So now let's move on to the things that live in the waters, fish and other aquatic life. Now, we are also given two criteria for determining whether something that lives in the waters is clean or unclean. And that is, they must have both fins and also scales. They must have both fins and scales in order to be clean. Otherwise, they are unclean. So let's think about some examples of this. Now, most catfish and eels and other fish like those, they have fins, but they don't have scales. They don't have scales as a scaled fish would. They are distinct from that, and they have smooth skin. So they are unclean. We're not allowed to eat them. Also, let's look at crabs, shellfish, and aquatic snakes. These animals do not have fins, so therefore they are not clean. They are unclean. We are not to eat them. So what are some examples of some clean fish? There are a lot out there, and just a few. We've got salmon and bass, mackerel, whiting, tilapia, trout. So there are quite a few of clean fish out there. They must have both fins and scales. So now let's talk about flying animals. Now, flying animals like birds, they do not fall under a list of criteria as with fish or with beasts. Instead, we're talking about a list of prohibited birds. So if we look in Leviticus 11 and also in Deuteronomy 14, it gives us a list of unclean birds. And we are told that these are unclean and we're not supposed to eat them, and that we're supposed to not eat them according to their kind. We're not given specific features to look for or anything like that. We're simply told the ones we're not supposed to eat. Now, this kind of deserves its whole own separate video, and we'll see about that in the future. And instead, what I'm going to do is focus on some examples of clean birds that are talked about in the text. Now, as far as I can tell, there are 3 clean birds which are referred to in the Torah, and 2 examples are referred to as being used in the ritual slaughters, so therefore they are clean. Those include pigeons and doves. If you look into studying the anatomy of the pigeon and the dove, they're actually very interesting because they have what's called crop milk. They actually feed their young differently than most birds do. They are very distinct when it comes to flying animals. Now, another example is a little bit controversial. It's the word in Hebrew, it's salal. Now, this is commonly translated as quail. However, if we look at the Septuagint, you'll see that it does not use the word for quail, actually. It says the bird which migrates with the quail. And this probably refers to the corncrake, a bird that many of us probably haven't heard of before. These birds apparently are clean. They are implied to be clean because they are what God is said to have fed the Israelites with. Now, for those of you who have heard the term quail before, I challenge you to look into the evidence for whether it actually says quail or not. You will see that there is a dispute over the validity of that claim. It is simply a tradition. And if we look at the Septuagint, as I said, interestingly, it does not say quail, and that would be an interesting thing to change if they were just changing it for some ulterior motive. So we have 3 types of clean birds mentioned in the text. We've got different kinds of doves and pigeons, and also we've got, apparently, the corncrake. Now, moving on, things like rodents and reptiles are just totally forbidden. They're all unclean. We're not supposed to eat them. Just vermin in general are unclean. And you can see that mentioned, that talked about in Leviticus 11, for example. However, there is one exception to this, and that is grasshoppers. Now, we are told an anatomical feature to look for as far as these clean insects, and that is that they have legs above their feet with which to leap. So those are clean. We are allowed to eat grasshoppers if we so choose. So this is how the text tells us to determine what is clean and what is unclean, to divide between the clean, divide between the unclean. So now we know how to do it with beasts. We look for, does it ascend the cud? Does it have cloven hooves? With aquatic life, we look for, does it have fins? Does it have scales? And in both cases, they need to have both. Then we are given the list with the birds we can check out, we'll talk about in the future. And with insects, does it have a leg above its feet to leap with? So now we know the criteria, the actual textual criteria for how we're to distinguish between clean and unclean animals according to the text of the law. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like this video and to share it. Share it with those people that you know care about this sort of thing, who are interested in what the text actually says and interested in doing it. Feel free to like this video and to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already so we can stay in touch. Thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Peace.